What's your carnal theory?
Hey there, you're listening to Carnal Theory, where we talk with experts from around the world to learn how taking command of our sexual story affects our personal wellness, sexual experiences, and relationships with ourselves and others. Hello and welcome. Today on Carnal Theory, we are sitting down with Danielle Bezalel. Danielle has a master's of public health from Columbia University with expertise in sexual and reproductive health and holds a BA in film and media studies from UC Berkeley. She's currently the head of content for Dame Products, as well as being the creator, executive producer, and host of Sex Ed with DB, which is an intersectional feminist podcast for folks who want to hear real stories from Bay Area voices as they try to revolutionize the way that we talk about sex. And that's how we found you. That's how we stalked you until we got a hold of you and just have been watching the beautiful, very educational work that you do for quite a while now, and literally could not be more thrilled to be chatting with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I am so glad that you brought us back to our original mission from our first season, which we were doing Bay Area Voices, but that mission has now melded and changed. And now the mission is that we are a feminist podcast bringing you all the sex ed you never got through unique and entertaining storytelling, really centering LGBTQ plus voices and by POC. And that's the most recent iteration, but we've gone through a lot of changes. And so that's awesome that you are a listener. I really appreciate being on.
Absolutely. Our pleasure, really. So Danielle, we're going to kick off with the theory that you brought for our consideration. And just as a reminder for our listeners, we start each episode and we end each episode with a carnal theory that our guests have brought to the table. And this theory is meant to challenge a presumption or a perception that we might have, often in regards to our monthly theme, which this one, we're going to pull it in a little bit. This one does. And it's a pretty, our monthly theme is pretty hard this month. It's female genital mutilation. So it's like it's been heavy. It's a heavy topic to discuss. I think I have some questions about your story and how you got into sex ed that I actually think really loops to some of the oppressive measures that female genital mutilation, which we'll refer to mostly as FGM if we bring it up again in the episode. But yeah, so we want to kick off with your theory for our discussion, and we'll loop back on it at the end of the show just to see if during this conversation even maybe presumptions or perceptions have changed. So if you could, Danielle, please.
Awesome. Yes. So my theory is that sex, under the umbrella term of sex, is so much more than penetration. And so what I mean by that is there's this awesome word called outer course. And outer course can be really, really just as intimate and pleasurable and fun and important and bad as intercourse. And so I just think that it's important for folks to know that, to see that, to understand that, and to dig deeper into that concept.
Really appreciate you bringing this, because while I do feel like there's a lot of wonderful strides being made in sex education, what we are defining as sex is still, I'm going to say, harmful.
Yes, as you should.
Yeah, it doesn't behoove us. So part of my question here is this is relatively revolutionary, this mindset of that sex is more than just penetration. Why do you feel that shifting that conversation in that direction is so important?
Yeah, I think multiple reasons. I mean, first and foremost, when we're talking about penis vagina sex, we're typically talking about cis straight sex. And what I mean by that is there's a cis woman and there's a cis man. And the only way for there to be pleasure is for them to have vaginal intercourse. And so I think like there are so many issues with that. And first and foremost, it's that we are not being inclusive. We are not being inclusive of LGBTQ experiences. We are not being inclusive of the many other ways that folks with vulvas in particular receive pleasure. So that's kind of like the first bucket of why this is problematic. And the second bucket, kind of like to my earlier point about people with vulvas really experiencing pleasure in other ways, I have a really important statistic to share, which is that 70 to 80% of people with vulvas require clitoral stimulation in order to reach orgasm. So like when we think about the be all end all of sex being PV sex and that being the best kind of sex, how are people with vulvas feeling about that? Sure, maybe they enjoy it, but maybe they don't. Maybe they aren't able to reach climax if that's a goal of theirs for sex. And that's a problem. And so that's another issue I have with it. I think the third issue mainly that I have with it is that, as I kind of mentioned before, outer course, we're really forgetting about all these other ways that we receive pleasure and give pleasure to our partners when it comes to sex and when it comes to pleasure. So when it comes to outer course, I really want to be clear that that means anything external that's happening, whether that be kissing, touching, nipple play, clitoral play. And so I just think it's so important to highlight that plenty of people consider that to be sex. And we should be affirming the fact that that kind of sex is just as important, pleasurable, fun, exciting as penetrative sex can be for people.
That's a great breakdown. To that, in terms of what sex is being defined as, not only, as you're pointing out, but just to underline, not only can people orgasm from non-penetrative sex. So even if we want to go like how we're taught via porn, what sex is, if orgasm is the end goal, then like, isn't that sex? Like for anybody who's maybe questioning, like, I don't agree that that's sex, like, if people can orgasm from nipple play, does that not make it? Does that fit into that box a little bit better when you're thinking about it that way? Not to mention, mind, oral, et cetera, et cetera. Also, you mentioning what you said, 70 to 80%?
70 to 80% of people with vulvas. Yeah.
Yeah. So looping that back to the month's theme of FGM, that means that women who've had genital mutilation, which is their clitoris being removed, usually very traumatically, that is literally wiping away possibly any chance for them to ever experience orgasm and ever have that experience. So then expanding what sex is for them, there still needs, even if you have been mutilated, there still needs to be a larger inclusive definition being created, because just because they aren't getting the same type of pleasure doesn't mean that they're not having sex. It doesn't mean that there aren't other forms of pleasure that they can benefit from, like you're talking nipple play, et cetera, et cetera. So just like literally all across, it benefits us from, to have a more inclusive definition. Yeah.
Yes. And something that you just brought up about FGM, and something that I feel compelled to share, which is something that I learned when I was getting my master's at Columbia, is that twofold. One, I do want to be clear that FGM does range. The definition of FGM, there are like multiple levels of it. So it can range anything from ceremonial genital nicking or cutting to the most extreme form of FGM, which is the removal of the clitoris. But I do want to add the nuance, which is that there are multiple levels of this. And if one community experiences or performs FGM, it doesn't necessarily look like what another community looks like. And so the second part that I do want to add about that is that FGM is a very complex and complicated topic to tackle, because it is tied to cultural and religious backgrounds. And so I do think while we're having this conversation, it's important, us in particular, as two like white presenting people, to recognize the fact that people of color have been doing this all around the world for thousands and thousands of years. And that does not make it correct. But I think it's important to add that nuance and to recognize the fact that there are cultural and religious roots tied to this. So when we're trying to ensure that young vulva havers, whether they identify as women or not, are not, we don't want to subject them to that as people very far away from their communities. But I do think that ultimately the goal that we as sex educators try to explain is that the reason why FGM comes up is because people with vulvas deserve to have pleasurable, happy, healthy lives. And FGM can potentially get in the way of that. So all that being said, I do think that nuance and context and background is critical to add when having conversations about this.
1,000,000%. And that's a perfect segue. You said that much better than I could have. That's a perfect segue of what I wanted to get into, which we'll see how can you share the story of how you started sex ed?
Sure. Yes. Yes.
And why the motivational moment that you had, the aha moment.
Yes, very, very relevant to kind of what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also I want to share this while recognizing that this is a story about Israel and my experience in Israel. And I also just want to recognize that right in this moment, Israel and Palestine are experiencing a very, very fraught and horrific war that has gone on for a very, very long time. And so I do want to recognize the fact that there is a lot happening. And as a Jewish person who has family in Israel, while recognizing the fact that Palestinian people are experiencing horrific violations of human rights, I just want to like name that this is going on before I kind of share this story about Israel. But
thank you.
Yeah, of course. So to get into a little bit about my experience, the year after I graduated from college, I went to Israel for a year to teach English, and my teaching cohort went on a field trip, as we did many times throughout the month, in order to experience different cultures and different parts of the land and different food and etc. And so one of these field trips, we went to Jerusalem, the super religious community called the Community of the Bells. And this main rabbi there was kind of showing us around and sharing his traditions and his customs and showing us this beautiful big synagogue. And kind of offhandedly, while he's talking about his family, he says, I have 5 daughters. And when each of them reach the age of 17 or 18, we marry them off by the matchmaker. And they don't learn about sex until they have it on their wedding night. And there was so much wrong with that to me as like someone who, granted, like had recently graduated from college and really started to understand through various classes about sexual health and gender, and just recognizing that I was so not okay with so many things that this person had said. And I was the only person in the room who kind of like visibly was getting a little like heated. And so I kind of raised my hand and everyone kind of like looked my way. And I kind of said like, what about what they want? What about, their consent, or what about their bodies, or what about, what if they don't want to be mothers? Like there are so many questions to ask someone who just makes an assumption like that or makes a statement. And he kind of just waved me off and he was like, well, this is just how it goes here. And so that was kind of my aha moment of like, oh, I feel so sure that this is not how it should go. There are so many young people who are at the mercy of their parents or teachers who are too uncomfortable about sex and sexuality for them to learn about it. And it's no one's fault, but the people who should be exposing them to things they need to be exposed to in order to live happy, healthy, pleasurable lives. And so in that moment, I kind of decided that my life journey should be in sexual education, whether that meant that I would work in the classroom or just work with young people or, work for an app that was doing this. I was like 22 at the time, so I really wasn't sure like what this world looked like. But that's kind of when I found the MPH program through Columbia. And around that time, when I came back to the US, that's also when Trump was elected president. And so that was like, 2016. Everyone was obviously in shock. And the podcast was a way for me to really take action and like do something and actively fight against the public misogyny and sexism that was on this very public arena that Trump was really perpetuating. And so I think the podcast for me, in addition to applying to get my MPH and focus on sexual health, were kind of two ways for me to actively fight back against this oppression that I feel like not only me, but many people in other positions who didn't have access to the internet and didn't have access to friends and family who were willing to talk about these things. And I was so lucky that my mom is an OBGYN, and like I, have many of my passions of sexual and reproductive health from her and from growing up with like, imperfect, but still amazing conversations around my body and my health and relationships. And I think like all of that put together really made me realize just how important these topics were to me and how I wanted to pretty much engage with them in some capacity for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I'm sure it would have struck you if it hadn't been for that story, but it's definitely a great and powerful story to have had. But when I read that, one of the things that I was curious about is, was there any reason that rabbi brought that up to begin with? Like, it seems like such a taboo thing to have even, I mean, as you just described it offhandedly, they mention, but like, even just to have offhandedly mentioned that, I was kind of like, well, how did that even come up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I honestly don't know like what the hell the precursor was to this. I think like maybe we were talking about the fact that they didn't allow their kids to access internet. And I think like from there, people were asking more questions about like, how do you like, pretty much it's because like they were talking about how people marry each other like in the community. And then kind of the matchmaker thing got brought up. So I think it like was honestly just him sharing about his life and like that was a part of it. And it's so hard because you think about aha moments and like memory is such an interesting thing because I remember like so deeply that story. But I'm sure that if I asked other people in the room, they remember it differently and they remember different things that he said or don't remember him saying that, but that is genuinely the best of my ability, remembering like that's what he said. And that's why it has stuck after all of these years, because I was so triggered by it and so offended by it that I just like I don't think I could forget it.
And do you remember in that moment feeling like, because we were just talking about, as you were eloquently underlining, how these cultural traditions, rituals, that though they are rituals or traditions, they're not necessarily for the good of a person or a culture. And one of my questions was like, in that moment, you stood up and you were questioning it. And that like triggered your entire trajectory, realistically.
Yeah.
So like these moments in these people's lives also have the potential to have, set their trajectory of what their lives are going to be. As you were saying, like, what if they're not even ready to be mothers yet? These are actions. As I remember reading it, he says like, and hope like they'll have sex that night of their marriage and hopefully they'll become mothers like that night, like,
right, like
that will be it.
Baruch Hashem, like, thank God, we pray in God that happens basically, because like in the Orthodox tradition, and this was another like facet that's super interesting, like everyone in the room was Jewish, right? So it's not necessarily that we were like at odds religiously, but
right.
when you look at any religion, right? Like hyper religious people, they have very different values and very different expectations as to what a family should look like, what your life goals should be. And I don't know if you've seen the show called Unorthodox, but it's fantastic because it's so realistic of like in the Orthodox community, like if you are traditional as like other Orthodox people are, if you're a woman, a cis woman, like your goal is to have as many kids as possible because that is a mitzvah to grow your family. And so in Unorthodox, they literally show a scene of like someone coming over because the main character was having painful sex, which again is not something that they would really talk about openly because it's shameful and embarrassing. But she literally like comes over and like espouses this like bullshit about sex ed that is not real. And it's so harmful and so terrible. And that's like, it's just so interesting to me that like, again, we are all Jewish, and it's really because these Orthodox people have grown up in the community and they can't leave, because if they leave, then they literally can never, some of them, it depends on, this is like a mass generalization, but pretty much like, then you're like excommunicated like from the community, and you aren't allowed to access your family or your friends, and you like have no family after that. So it's like, if I was a woman put in that position and I was told all my life, like, you were put on this earth to like get married and have more kids and like raise a family, like if I didn't have access to the internet, which these people in this community did not, if I didn't have access to people outside of my culture, religion, background, I would probably do the same fucking thing. Like, I don't blame these women. I blame this like oppressive patriarchal culture and sect of the religion, and sects of many religions that are like this, that don't allow people to understand important knowledge about themselves, their bodies, how to relate to other people, because it's harmful and it's terrible that they don't get that chance that many other people do simply because of the family they were born into.
And I have a question there. I wonder how different you see the lack of education of like, okay, what most people don't know when it comes to sex ed, and what like this Orthodox community doesn't know. Because my gut says there's actually more overlap than maybe we think.
Totally.
Like,
yes.
There's just a lack.
A large lack, yes. And the thing that I really want to share with you are some statistics from this really amazing research institute called the Guttmacher Institute. And what they do is a lot of really great research and articles and studies on the state of sex education in America, not only in schools, but about policies that are happening, how harmful some of these state policies are towards LGBTQ youth. Like, there are many, basically, there are many ways that Guttmacher is telling us that sex ed in America is bad, generally. And so some interesting and really sad statistics that I want to share, and this is recent, this is like from last month, pretty much, updated last month, that only 18 out of 50 states require program content to be medically accurate. Only 9 states require the program to provide instruction that's appropriate for each student's cultural background, that's not biased against any race, sex, or ethnicity. Only 3 states prohibit the program from promoting religion, which is like, oh, so that means pretty much all states in America, like teachers, if they're super Catholic or super Jewish or what have you, can promote their own religion in the class. That's fucked up. 36 states and DC allow parents the option to remove their child from instruction. Can this happen with math? Can this happen with science? I don't think so. So like, we're really clearly not valuing health education as much as we are other subjects. A couple other ones that I'll share before I'll share some of the good stuff, which is 20 states and DC require provision of information on contraception. That is less than half of required states that do that. And this is the last one I'll share, although as you can imagine, there are many more. 28 states require that abstinence be stressed. So that's not only that abstinence should be taught, which it should, because it's a viable option for people to engage with if they so choose, but stressed is a huge problem. So some of the good stuff, though, is that 40 states and DC require school districts to involve parents in sex education, HIV education, or both. This is amazing. As a sex educator, we want to be including parents in the conversation because it really is a team effort of parents and schools being able to band together to teach young people the things that they need, in addition to books, media, resources. But it really starts with parents, and schools have a big part to play. 35 states and DC require provision of information about skills for healthy romantic and sexual relationships. Would love it to be in the 40s, would love it to be all 50, but 35 is pretty good. Two more stats: 31 states and DC require information on healthy relationships. 38 states and DC require prevention of teen dating violence and sexual violence, which, again, super important. It should not be the sole thing that classrooms cover, but all that to say is that you're correct in that you don't have to be from a super religious background to experience the horrific sex education that most people, especially folks who are from the South and from the Midwest, experience. And so that is a huge problem. And I think that people should be knowing those statistics and really understanding that they need to change in order to change cultural norms.
Yeah, and I'd like to call out two things in there. One is these are educational institutions. This is where people go to get knowledge, to be educated. And that first stat, I think it's 18.
18.
Yeah. That's how many that require like factual,
medically accurate. And like, can you imagine if a school didn't have to teach 2 + 2 = 4? Correct.
Like this is saying that that a certain subject matter is allowed to be warped and completely made incorrect and taught incorrectly, and that is not only accepted, but that is school protocol.
Yeah.
Horrific.
Truly. And this doesn't, and I want to be clear because I think that it's easy to like misconstrue. I don't think necessarily that there are like schools out there who are part of the, 32 states out of this statistic who are intentionally hurting children with information. But by proxy, what I mean by that is just because a state doesn't in its laws require medically accurate information, they still might have it, but it might not be looked at as closely as it needs to. So I don't think that there are educators out there who are intending to give children, evil kind of in the background, like I'm going to trick little Jessie today in class. It's more so this idea that like it's not normal and we shouldn't accept it as normal for not all 50 states to have intentional language that say require medically accurate information. And that I think is the important part of this.
Yeah, no, I am totally with you. Somewhere in there in my head, it kind of I'm totally with you, but it kind of becomes null because like, if they are not required, then that can happen. And like, that's the point.
And it does, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely does. Yes. Yeah. It super problematic.
Yeah. And I also just want to call out, like, we're here in the United States where we think of ourselves as free and liberated and educated and able to get information and it be correct and be able to do things. We're lucky and it's this bad. Like, yeah. And it also just makes me call to mind, think like, this is a skill that you take, or a skill, this is a part of your life that you take with you. Like this math, you may or may not need to know 2 + 2 = 4 later on. Like you may or may not have to tap into that. But like sex and your sexuality is going to be a piece of you.
Health education is your life. Like yes. I fully believe that health education, every piece of it comes up at some point in your life and makes you a better communicator, makes you a better friend, a better partner, a better teacher, a better employee, like person. It makes you a better person. And there are so many things that people don't consider to be important in health class. And they're just wrong. Like if sex ed is taught in a way and health ed are taught in a way that is comprehensive, pleasure-centered, non-judgmental, medically accurate, LGBTQ plus inclusive, yada, 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 if it has all of these important qualifiers, then it's so necessary to every single person who has friends in life, who has relationships, who wants to understand and be kind to themselves. Like you don't even have to interact with the outside world to need sex education, because it really does influence so many parts of your life so deeply.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what we're about too, for sure. Yeah, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but it also just makes me think, like, imagine like a driver's course where they like don't teach you things properly and it just causes shit tons of accidents and wrecks. Like, we would fucking change that course.
Right.
Like, that would be unacceptable if 80+% walked out of that course and like didn't know how to do a left-hand turn. We would fix that because we would see that as a public safety threat. We look at our sex education, we see the lack of knowledge there, and the and uneducated choices that can be made from that lack of knowledge, and we do nothing about it. We just clam up and keep our mouth shut, and that is disgusting to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, because it really is so intentional. Like this did not happen on accident, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm getting at. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, right. So like if you look at the history and look at politics in this country and recognize the fact that religion is so deeply intertwined in like funding for abstinence only education, and like all of these things are happening because super religious white men in positions of power and women were able to have such grave influence on the type of education, federally funded at least, that folks receive in the US. And I'll say it again, like it's not an accident. Like all of this has kind of been building and building for decades. And we are finally, I think, at a place where people are waking up about it and starting to understand how problematic this is. And I'm sure that many people have been fighting the good fight for as many years as ab-only education has been around. But it really is the culmination of so many intentional, problematic laws and problematic policies that have been around for decades.
Yeah. If you could we loop back to the theory that you brought for us? Because I think also part of what you just mentioned, that's like our relationship to our education system and like our government, but like having healthy relationships, how we have healthy relationships in our lives and how those can end up influencing our sexuality, and having relationships that can comprehend and respect what our view of sex is also so important. So I just want to loop back to the theory that you brought for our consideration, and maybe just for a minute talk on the importance of healthy relationships and how we can have those.
Totally. Yeah. Really, really good and complex question. I think healthy relationships, similar to the theory, right? That like penetration is not the be all end all of sex. Like we have to learn and internalize that. And for healthy relationships, that is another topic of sex education that needs to be learned and practiced and understood, also simultaneously what unhealthy relationships look like. So one organization that I really want to call out is One Love Foundation. They do really awesome workshops with young people about understanding and recognizing the signs of healthy relationships as well as unhealthy relationships. And I have their website pulled up because they have already done all this amazing work. And I want to share a couple of their signs of a healthy relationship. So these are their 10 signs of a healthy relationship: comfortable pace, trust, honesty, independence, respect, equality, kindness, taking responsibilities, healthy conflict, and fun. And I love all of these because they really bring such different and nuanced ways to share that, yes, everyone has different kinds of relationships, and not no two relationships can really be judged in the same way. But all of these signs really make sense to me. And especially, I want to call out like healthy conflict. Like, I think there's this assumption that if you're in a relationship, then you're not arguing or everything is super easy. And the reality is, like, no, people should be discussing hard, challenging things. And part of that is how to healthily engage in conflict with a partner. And so, I also would love to share some signs of an unhealthy relationship, because I think that often we see like movies and TV shows and we think that those are the healthy relationships, but honestly, they're usually the unhealthy relationships, because it's like drama and it's good TV. And like, that's what we're being taught as young people, is that like, this is the, passion or whatever that you should be aiming for. But here are 10 signs of an unhealthy relationship, which are intensity, possessiveness, manipulation, isolation, sabotage, belittling, guilting, volatility, deflecting responsibility, and betrayal. So I think like these are also super important to really understand and reflect upon, because if you are someone who is engaging in an unhealthy relationship, whether that be you are the recipient of some of this behavior or you are the person who is doing this behavior, whether you're the proponent of the behavior, it's an issue. And I think like if one or multiple of these things is happening to a certain degree, obviously, if there is physical, emotional, mental, financial abuse, then that is unacceptable. And if you're someone who's listening who's experiencing that, we can add in the caption of this episode some resources. But if it's something that you think is not that abuse and is something that you can change in the relationship, that it is happening in a way that you want to change your behavior and your thought patterns and your actions, I do think that that's also possible. I do want to like share that depending on the relationship, and obviously this is super nuanced, if someone is getting into an argument with their partner over and over again about something that you think can change and can be looked at or addressed in a healthier way, there are tools like therapy. There are, different kinds of ways to approach that. And so with all that being said, I think like all of this just basically has to do with like really solid, comprehensive education that does share that nuance, that does let young people and people who are learning practice certain scenarios, practice talking, thinking, understanding these things. And what's a good finishing line for that? Sorry.
Well, it's encouraging that those resources exist, and also upsetting that is not something that I just, that I haven't already memorized, and that I'm not able to take with me in my day-to-day life going, okay, this person is checking off this person is not doing this. I need to assess this relationship. Instead, we just have, as you pointed out, probably not the best of role models that we see, commercials, TV, probably our real lives, because they didn't have good education or influences. So like, it's a vicious cycle when we don't choose to break it.
Right.
And a really solid way throughout history of breaking bad things is to re-educate in a better, inclusive and correct way. So thank you for sharing that. Can you share your carnal theory with us one more time, and then we'll wrap up?
Yes. And by the way, thank you for having me again. This has been such a fruitful, really awesome conversation, and I'm happy to be a part of it. But my carnal theory, one more time, is that sex is so, so much more than penetration, and that outer course in particular can be just as intimate and pleasurable as intercourse.
And listeners, I hope that you take that with you, that you think about that you reflect on what that means for you and within your sexual biography, how that does or doesn't resonate. And if it doesn't resonate, maybe some consideration of a partner, past or present, where maybe that was what aligned more with them, and how you might consider that for your future. So thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope that this episode has given you something further to reflect upon. Please reach out to us with your questions or insights on our Instagram page at Carnal Theory or at My Sex Bio. And do not forget, please check out Danielle's amazing work on TikTok, which is at SexEd with DB, and on Instagram, SexEd with DB podcast. Listen to her podcast. There's a lot of information over there. Thank you deeply. Thank you so much for being with us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Carnal Theory is produced by My Sex Bio. Our sound design is by Audrey Cohane, and our theme music by Men the Universe. My Sex Bio is an educational platform built to empower people like you to take command of your sexual biography. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify at My Sex Bio. Visit our website and join our e-letter at mysexbio.org, and support our work by joining our Patreon. Thank you.